and mental health. And what we found on average, people who attend religious services frequently had better mental health than those who didn't attend. But we went a step further and we unpacked. We asked people, what happens at your place of worship? Are you supported at your place of worship? And we find that people who reported that at a place of worship they received support from others and were affirmed had better mental health. But people who said at their place of worship, people make too many demands on them and people are critical of them and the things they do had worse mental health. So that even going to church, what's happening at church and how we relate to others at church, literally, we can be a purveyor of bad mental health just by our attitude and the way we relate to others. As similarly, we can be a source of affirmation and positive psychological well-being by being supportive and caring of others.
Wow, that is amazing. Thank you so much for sharing that perspective because it makes me start to think about the fact that community can be a protective factor, but within the religious setting, it can also be a risk factor depending on the sociocultural factors that are there. And many times we don't recognize that. Within the Caribbean, we have greetings, and I loved what Latoya Arthur Tucker would have said. We changed things a bit into the way that we greet people. And I'm thinking of my own Trinbago experience, as I would put it. And I'm thinking of the way that we greet one another. I see you in a long time, but how you put on so much weight? How you get fat so? And this is supposed to be in love and encouragement. I'm saying it not personally, but I'm saying it. That is a part of the Caribbean culture that we have to start to recognize. Might be a part that might be a bit of a risk factor instead of a protective factor. Speaking about protective factors, I actually would like to ask Dr. Liverpool, who has been in direct practice and has been bridging both psychology and also the religious world as a practitioner. I would like to ask him, what has he seen in terms of the realities of what you just heard from Dr. Williams? Can religion be a protective factor or can it be a risk factor? What has been your experience within being an ordained minister for so many years, as well as being a psychologist?
Okay, before I answer the question, I would like to give a personal story. Never thought of ministry, never preached a sermon in my life. I was 19 years old, standing in a cemetery where my cousin was to be buried. He had committed suicide. I was 19, he was 25. And I was the only person in the house that went to church. So we were waiting and waiting for the minister. And a lady who had buried her husband about half an hour earlier said to my cousin, Ethel, what are you waiting for? We're waiting for the preacher. And she said, they don't bury suicides. And at that time, my cousin said to me, Errol, we can't put him down like that. You got to say something. That's the first time I've ever preached in my life. I don't know what it is I said. That was a Wednesday evening. The Thursday morning, early, two young ladies came and knocked on the door looking for the pastor. And I was invited to come and preach at the Pentecostal church. Of course, I declined it. Never preached in my life before. That Sabbath, I went to church and Bernard McPherson was preaching. And he uttered these words, some of you men are finished with your O-levels. You don't know what you want to do with your life. Why don't you consider the ministry? That was in September of 1975. In January of 1976, I was at West Indies College preparing for ministry. So my first introduction had to do with the suicide death of my cousin. So let me address the question in terms of a risk factor. While studies have shown that church affiliation, church attendance, and church support can be positives in terms of helping the prevention of suicide, there can also be in church a rigidity, a sense that you are not measuring up to God. If the church has certain views and positions, and you know you're not living according to those views and positions, and there are people reminding you of it, and you feel that you have fallen short, you've not made the grade, we have found that that's a factor, a risk factor for people to say, you know what, I have disappointed my God, I've disappointed my church, I've disappointed my family, let me exit. Now, on another hand, a positive factor with religion is that the fear of God and that you will not be saved play a role in stopping some people from committing suicide. So it has a positive factor, but also a negative factor. And I just want to, before I conclude this section, just want to reiterate or reaffirm the position that when we think of our overall health, we're talking about life challenges. Adam was perfect, but then he fell. And because of life challenges, we will have challenges in areas of cognition, our ability to think, to remember, to reason. We will have challenges in the area of emotion, our attachment. We will have challenges with our social interactions. Those three things are very important to overall mental health.
Thank you so much, first, for sharing that story. I think it helps us to have a sober reminder of the challenges that we all face. And it also reminds me of the fact that people put those number ones in the chat, stating that they would have had challenges or seen people with challenges with mental and emotional health. So it's something that affects us all deeply. Praise God that he was able to utilize that experience to allow you to become a mental health practitioner to help others as you move forward. You raised several critical issues, and you actually allowed us to advance the conversation towards the topic of suicide a little bit. But before we went to that space, I wanted to just connect with Rayvon Case, who's on with us as well, who's a practitioner. And I want to ask him about some of the attitudes that he encounters, both in the Caribbean and in the states where he works, and how those attitudes compare, and potentially even how some of the attitudes can be contrasted between the cultures, the one that he comes from and the one where he serves. And maybe that will allow us to get into the next segment that we're going to talk a little bit more about suicide and suicidal ideation. Rayvon, you just need to unmute, please. Thank you.
Okay. I hope you can hear me clearly.
Got you. Perfect.
Awesome. Yeah, and thanks for having me. So I want to say, well, my introduction to the field, or part of my curiosity, which led to me being in the field, was also my experience growing up and the different things I saw. I can recall one of my first experiences of hearing that somebody died by suicide was a bus driver who used to pick me up in the mornings. And then all of a sudden, I realized that this driver was not around. I was like, what's happening? I haven't seen this driver for like a week, 2 weeks, until I heard that, oh, he died by suicide. And then the stigma that attached to that was that sometimes individuals did not attend the funeral services, or you just didn't know what happened. The person just disappeared. There were no family members. There wasn't support provided to the family members. That sort of things existed. So what I've found within the field in general, it's been a mixture. So individuals who struggle with suicidal ideations or thoughts of suicide, generally individuals from the Caribbean, if they're struggling with it, they don't have the support. So they're scared to talk to their parents or family members or friends because they feel as though they're going to be judged, which doesn't help the situation. So a lot of individuals end up sticking with that feeling by themselves until they find somebody trusted that they can talk to, or it gets to the point where we can only hold so much for a certain point until everything escalates, and then they act out, and that's how some individuals end up in treatment. So I've seen a mixture, and then we have seen where individuals who have supportive family members from the Caribbean, so their family members are open to talking about mental health and supporting individuals. I've seen where that, on the other hand, has helped individuals so they've been able to thrive and just to live the life that they want to live. So I've seen both sides of it. And again, it's based on the support that individuals have and the stigma attached to mental health in general.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the fact that you let us know that culture does play an amazing part, a major part in people's experiences with mental health. And as we get into the next segment, before we get into the next segment, I just want to ask Pastor Mariah to just give us the 2 minutes or 2 second, I should say, 2 second break as we're about to switch gears and as we get into the next segment. We're about to talk a little more in depth about suicidal ideation. So this is an opportunity that you have to share with those who are not on as yet. We're going to talk about suicide. I'm going to be pushing the panelists to talk a little bit more about mental health and how it affects us in terms of suicide, and also how the church can be a protective factor, as we heard Dr. Williams talk about. Because really and truly, we want to empower our church members and the community at large, because God has asked us to serve the community, to serve those who are suffering. So we want to empower those. So we want to share this information with them as much as possible. So you still have some time to go ahead and share the link at this point in time. Pastor Mariah, please go ahead.
Well, thanks, Pastor Springer. While our tech team is getting our 2 seconds Caribbean time video clip going, I just would like to share with you, our promote clip is going to tell you, for those who are joining us, are hearing about SAP for the first time, it's going to give you a brief overview of what SAP is about. One of the things, we have a platform that is dual. We address issues affecting the Seventh-day Adventist community and the wider community in the Caribbean and diaspora. We also have a SAP journal while we get in our video ready. And our SAP journal that we have started this year, we'll be focusing on holistic Christian development. And so we have sent a call out for papers for those who are interested in writing articles on spirituality, mental health. That's one issue we're talking about tonight. Physical development, social development, intellectual development, nutrition, and well-being. So you're going to see our flyer in the chat. You're welcome to contact us via email. We're glad to have you. Over to our tech team as they run our video promo. Thanks, Pastor Springer.
No problem. As we wait, we still want to invite people to continue sharing the link.
Perhaps you can go ahead, Pastor Springer, and the video is going to
They'll
come
do
at
it.
the end.
Perfect. That's perfect.
We're having
No
some
problem.
technical challenges.
That's fine. I understand, and we're thankful for those who remained on to the first part with us, and we are grateful to those who are right now taking up their cell phones and sending the link via WhatsApp. Man, you send TikTok videos to your friends, so why can't you send this information out to someone right now? I know you send TikTok videos. It's okay. You can do it. It's fine. Send this like it was a TikTok video. I'm seeing that we have a definite comment that is going to be addressed in a second. So I love the fact that Corinthia Dupuy, I hope I pronounced that correctly, put a question and at least a comment that will help us as we get into the next section. So this segment, we're going to actually be talking about some of the questions related to suicidal ideation and suicide. This is a major challenge, and I just have to have a bit of a moment of self-disclosure. It's a challenging topic for me to speak about because someone who is close to me actually died by suicide. It happened several years ago, but that person died by suicide. And it was a major challenge, not only for me as a Seventh-day Adventist, to start to recognize how does my theology or how does God's theology allow for us to understand this a little more? And even how can we understand the grace of God as it moves forward through that? But then how can we understand how to help those who continue to face challenges with mental and emotional health to the point that it brings them to this place where the ideas of suicide or dying by suicide actually enter their mind? So I think there's an entire spectrum of experiences of people who have these ideas of dying by suicide. And I would love for us to just be able to explore some of those ideas. Dr. Reed, I'm just going back to you as you started us off talking about depression and saying that it's one of the most prevalent mental health illnesses here in the Caribbean. And I just wanted to ask you to just let us know how depression could be linked to death by suicide, if you can. And maybe you could even start to tell us a little bit about the prevalence, if you can, if you have any statistics, probably from Trinidad or even from the region, if you can. Thank you. You can go ahead and unmute. Thank you.
Yes. So you've asked a very broad question. I want to start by looking at mental health and suicide and the connection between the two. Okay. When we think of good mental health, we're really talking about good coping. I think one of the panelists mentioned the whole notion of stress and managing stress in life. Good mental health is about good coping, and as a result, being able to function optimally and have good interpersonal relationships. If you have someone who copes well with good relationships, that person will not have suicidal thoughts, that's ideation, or attempts, or suicidal behavior. When suicidal thoughts occur, we need to understand it as coming from generally one of two sources. Either you are not coping well, there is some kind of emotional crisis. And then if we go to dig deeper into that, most times when an emotional crisis occurs, it's because of some childhood trauma or because of the inability to develop coping skills over that period of development from childhood into adulthood. So it's either you're in a situation of crisis where you are so overwhelmed, you feel so hopeless that death seems to be the only way out, or it is a symptom of a mental health disorder. And you mentioned depression. Depression, we have to be very careful when we talk about it. People use the word loosely because of the internet and because of a certain amount of destigmatization of depression. People talk about feeling depressed. Children talk about feeling depressed. But we have depression, which is a feature of poor coping, and then we have major depression and bipolar depression, both of which are bona fide psychiatric disorders. In those psychiatric disorders, there's a disturbance of the brain chemistry. There is an imbalance. And as a result of that imbalance, there are several symptoms that occur, and suicidal ideation, suicidal behavior, are symptoms that can occur as a result of mental health disorders. So depression, the mood disorders, major depression, bipolar depression, are probably the two commonest psychiatric disorders that lead to suicidal behavior. There are other disorders which can cause suicidal behavior, like your psychotic disorders, but by far the mood disorders are the most common. Now, that suicidal ideation and behavior are to be distinguished from cutting. Cutting has grown in prevalence as a practicing psychiatrist. I've seen cutting grow in prevalence over the last several decades. And many times persons who cut do not want to die. It is more an expression of a need for psychological help. It's more an expression of being overwhelmed. And the cutting actually serves a purpose to relieve the psychological distress that the individual is experiencing. So I hope that distinction between suicidal ideation and cutting would have been made clear, and the fact that suicidal ideation and behavior arise from either overwhelming situations or bona fide mental health disorders. So you ask about the prevalence. The prevalence of depression is very high. I don't have statistics. In the Caribbean, we don't do epidemiological studies. They're too expensive. So we get our data from very small samples, all right? But we do know that it is very prevalent because we look at anecdotal studies and the anecdotal reports that come out from our clinical experience. With regard to suicide, in Trinidad and Tobago, the overall suicide rate is about 11 per 100,000 population. That sounds very low, but we are not to be misled by that. Because if you look at the different populations in the country or the subpopulations, you will find that among our youth, the adolescents and youth, the suicide rate is very high, as well as among males as a subgroup. So we look at age and we look at gender. And among the adolescents, we don't have any recent studies, but there was a survey done in 2017, and it showed that over the prior 12 months, 16% of males and 28% of females had actually thought about suicide. Now, as a practicing psychiatrist, it alarms me when I talk to young people and they ask me, so isn't thinking of suicide normal? And I have to say to them, no, it is not normal. It has become so prevalent that the youth have now normalized the idea of suicidal ideation. And among males, the prevalence is very high compared to females because females tend to think of and attempt suicide, but males tend to complete suicide, especially our older males. So I'll stop here because I've said a lot, but I hope that I have given you the answer you're looking for.
Yes, the question was deliberately asked to get that wide-ranging response. So it gives us many different jump-off points from which we can actually tackle this issue. Thank you so much, Dr. Lee. You raised the idea that cutting is one of those challenges, and you've actually made a distinction between suicidal ideation and cutting. You even allowed us to recognize that within the youth population, there is a significant increase, or is a high prevalence of that suicidal ideation. You didn't express that within Trinidad and Tobago, one of the countries within the Caribbean region, we see that older men may tend to be the ones who complete suicide. It's interesting that you say that, and even thinking about the fact we were thinking about the protective and risk factors from before. But even before we go that way, I'm thinking about the experience in some of the other spaces that we have around the Caribbean. So I'm going to ask some of the other panelists who may represent backgrounds that are diverse. It might be different from yours, to just share a little bit more on that same topic about what suicidal ideation looks like and the prevalence in their spaces where they're at. I see Dr. Williams opened his mic, so I suspect he's going to share something with us.
Well, I want to share with you what I say is the most disturbing study that I have read, scientific study I've read in a while. It was a study of suicide among elementary school children in the United States. This is national data for the US, not a sample, based on death certificate data. They looked between 1993 and 2012. These are children aged 5 to 11. And they found that the rate of suicide over this period of time was stable, didn't fluctuate much. However, when they broke the data down by race, it was stable only for Asian and Latino children, but suicide rates had markedly declined for white children and had doubled for Black children, aged 5 to 11. And the researchers were so stunned by this. For 100 years, if you looked at the 15 leading causes of death in the United States, the one where Blacks have always been lower than whites is suicide. And it's generally attributed in the scientific literature to probably the role of religion and higher levels of religious engagement in the African-American population in the United States. But this study was the first study to find higher rates of suicide among Blacks than whites, and it is of children aged 5 to 11. And for me, I try to think back to when I was in elementary school. Did I even know what suicide was? So to think of Black children committing suicide at such a rate is stunning. Now, that study doesn't tell us anything about the why. The people are dead. You look at a death certificate and you report the data. There is a study that was done recently that sheds light on why, and it's troubling. It's a national study, 12,000 children, average age 11 in the United States. And they are all alive, but it asked them about suicidal ideation. The Black children had the highest rates of suicidal ideation. They also asked the children about experiences of discrimination. The Black children had the highest rates of discrimination, that they had experienced racial discrimination in their lives. And they did statistical analyses where they looked at the relationship between race and suicidal ideation, and they statistically added the measure of discrimination to the model, and the effect of race went away. Simply put, the higher rates of suicidal ideation among Black children was completely accounted for by the higher rates of experiences of discrimination in the lives of 11-year-old children. So it says a lot about what does it feel like to be a Black child growing up in America today. And the question for us is, what are we going to do about it? How do we create those supportive, affirming environments that help children to realize you are, God made you, you are special, and God has a plan for your life, and you can deal with whatever life throws at you because God is on your side. So that's one area that I think it's worth thinking about, and I don't know the extent to which we have a similar problem in the region in terms of what children are looking at and what they are viewing, because at some point we should talk about social media and its impact
Yes.
on life,
Yes.
but you may get to that later.
Yes, definitely. So you actually just triggered my mind. So I'm thinking about the fact that America has its own unique experience. United States of America has its own unique experience. And if we think about Latin America and the Caribbean, because we have to think about the post-colonial experiences and post-slave experiences, the migratory patterns that would have influenced the superstructures that we live in or that we have that influence how we live today. I think that we have to recognize that it's not far-fetched to think or maybe extrapolate and guess or wonder whether or not those same problems or challenges could be happening within our own society, which is stratified, but in a different way. There are different levels. They may have discrimination. It may not be because of race, but it could be because of poverty or wealth levels. Inequality could be the substitute for racial discrimination within the Caribbean. It's possible. So you're actually sending my mind in so many different directions there with that thought. But I'm also thinking about the fact that we have other experiences within the Caribbean. I see there's a question that I think is really relative to what we're doing right now, and comes from Shane Butcher in the chat. And I want to pose it to both Latoya and Rayvon, and then come back to our other Dr. Liverpool, just to touch on those different questions, which are: what are the differences between suicidal ideation, plans, and attempts? So I would love for Latoya, if you could just give us an overview, or either Latoya or Rayvon, whichever one of you feels more impressed to deal with that at this point in time. And then the other one is going to be, does one state of being either having the ideation, the plan, or making the attempt, does one state always lead to the other attempt? Dr. Liverpool, as well, you could feel free to touch on that one, and Dr. Reed and Dr. Williams, feel free to touch on that one. But I'm starting off with Latoya and Rayvon. If you can assist us with what are the differences between suicidal ideation, plans, and attempts? Kindly open your mics and share.
All right. So, I don't remember the person who spoke this while before we go to the answer the question. I sat and when I listened to his remarks, or his comments rather, about the African children committing suicide because of discrimination, I just wanted to plug in to tell him, within the Caribbean, I think the children may have remedied that by using bleaching creams. Now, that was meant to be on the lighter side of things. Getting back to the serious business now. In terms of what are the differences between suicidal ideations, suicidal ideations are specifically linked to the thoughts, and the thoughts that can also be situational. And these, from my experience in working with adults and children, the ideations can lead to the plans, which can eventually end up with the attempts or the actual activity being completed. Now, in terms of the differences between the ideation and the plans, if I were to be very practical, there's some persons, they only have ideations. It's only within the head. It's circulating what, how, when, if, what, and all of that. There's some persons, amidst the ideations, they will actually have ideas and thoughts that will help them to actually carry it out. A lot of times it stays as an ideation because some persons are timid to actually experience the pain. So it remains something that is thought related. And the plans, it can vary where it transitions. And also, might I add, persons from experience again may have ideation based on their age and what they're exposed to. So some persons might not be able to actually have a plan. So it's just something that they're playing around with in their heads. And also I wanted to share, I think it's Dr. Sandra, if I'm seeing the name correct, when you mentioned some persons who are cutting, some persons also present with suicidal ideation in forms where they self-harm. And it's not necessarily related to cutting, because I remember having a client who would pierce herself every time she experienced something traumatic or painful. And by piercing, I meant she bored her nose or ears or eyes, all the places you can think about. And she did these without any painkillers. She did them just putting hot. Well, I don't really like sharing methods because persons are around, but she did these things and endured the pain. And when you spoke about these painful experiences, she disclosed that she actually thought about taking her own life, but because she wasn't courageous enough to carry it out, it was a step-by-step process that would ultimately result in her being no more. So the ideations can differ based on sex, based on a person's culture, based on what the person is exposed to, but many times it's one thing that can lead to the other and the other.
And
Thank you
and
so much.
and Rayan here, just adding to what was just shared. So in terms of suicidal ideation, in the work that we do in terms of assessing and the differences, so it's sometimes a preoccupation or a wish that somebody has to die. And in our work, we're also looking at the intensity of the suicidal ideation, and suicidal ideations, they fluctuate too. For some individuals, it's pretty intense. For some individuals, it just goes, it comes and it goes. So it fluctuates for a lot of individuals. So we try to look at that. And then for a suicide attempt, I would say that is more of a self-directed action that one does to end their life. So that's the difference between the suicidal ideation and the attempt. The attempt is an actual attempt that someone they've done something to end their life. Some individuals are successful in the attempt, whereas in a lot of cases, a lot of individuals aren't successful. So we try to at least catch what's happening with individuals. So once we hear that they have an ideation, that's where we try to implement certain interventions to support the individuals at that point. And I'll leave it there because I know the conversation is going to move forward and I don't want to jump ahead.
That's
Yeah,
fine.
let me just briefly say 3 words come to mind when we think of suicide ideation: thoughts, fantasies, contemplations. And I would like to go back to something Dr. Reed said. And just to add, in addition to depression being a factor for suicide, substance abuse or substance use is also highly correlated with suicide. I'm going to stop there.
If I may interject,
Sure.
Liverpool, it's Dr. Liverpool, that's such an important point, especially in the Caribbean. And what we have found in the clinical setting is that on many occasions when persons attempt suicide, it is under the influence of alcohol. So there is that relationship between not just alcohol use, but other substances, drugs as well, and the immediate use of alcohol preceding a suicide attempt. That is something that we have noticed, and really we should do more to look at.
So it's interesting that you all both bring up those two different pathways, if I could say like that. One of the things I'm thinking about is that in the Caribbean, we have a shared experience of a traumatic past, in that many of our ancestors would have had different forms of trauma that they would have shared, or that they would have suffered from. And it's interesting that we have developed different types of coping mechanisms. Some of those are maladaptive, if I could say it like that. Some of those are good, and some, I'm going to say it like this, and they must think some of those are positive, some of those are negative. Some are good and not so good, now some bad. So I'm thinking about the linkage between trauma and suicide within the Caribbean perspective. And as I mentioned that, I see someone actually is asking a question, or making a comment about sexual trauma, which is also highly correlated with suicide. When we look at the concept of trauma in itself, and we recognize that many people in the Caribbean have been survivors of trauma, then we also recognize why it could be possibly, it could help explain why we have such a high prevalence of potential suicide ideation. We don't have the evidence, as we said, Dr. Reed, we have just anecdotal evidence to support it, which is unfortunate because the studies need to be there to be able to allow us to address the issue head on. But I'm also thinking of the fact that as a church, we need to understand the linkage between mental health, trauma, and then how that can potentially relate to suicide and suicidal ideation. How can we foster a culture within our churches that will allow the church to be a more of a protective factor instead of a trigger for suicide and suicidal ideation? Would any one of you like to just touch on that topic for a quick second as we address one of the other questions afterward?
I mean, if you
I
want
would jump
start.
in. I would make the point that hope and optimism, faith in a higher power, can foster hope and optimism. They're hard to measure, but they are there. So a lot has to do with when it comes to church. Church cannot be a place of pessimism. Church cannot be a place of the constant beating of guilt and shame. There has to be a sense of hope and optimism. And studies have shown, maybe Dr. Williams can address these studies, religious practices such as prayer, meditation, and faith-based coping strategies can help individuals manage stress, adversity, and mental health challenges. So as it relates to the church, those are positive factors helping with stress, coping with adversity, and mental health strategies. Before I stop, I'm from Guyana. I don't know if you could hear my accent. I'm from Guyana. And I was proud of Guyana in 2024 when Guyana decriminalized suicide. That's an important factor. I don't know what's going on in the Twin Islands, another part of the Caribbean, but just think of how asinine it is that in an attempt to help with suicide, if you fail, we're going to charge you.
Yeah, that is a powerful reminder that, as I was saying before in the chat, Corinthia Dupree mentioned that we no longer use the word committed suicide because it cannot be treated as a criminal act. We say rather brought to an end to his or her life or died by suicide or ended up his or her life. That may be true, but as we look at it in some jurisdictions in the Caribbean, and Dr. Reed, you could assist me in just reminding me, Trinidad is one of those where
Yes.
suicide is still
Still
considered a
criminal.
crime.
Yes,
Yes,
it
it's
is.
actually on the law books. Thank you. So many people still utilize that word within our region. So there is a significant amount of stigma that's not only attached to mental and emotional health, even discussing it within the church setting. But then when you mention the word suicide or suicidal ideation, you have challenges that come up that are because of our culture. And actually, I think one of the questions that we have from Corinthia actually touches on that a bit. It says, is there a risk of planting the idea of suicide by asking about suicidal ideation? Should parents ask their children? Should teachers ask their students? Or should the question only be asked by a mental health professional? Very interesting question. Dr. Williams, I know you're up next, and then Dr. Reed, is it okay if I ask Dr. Williams first and then come over to you?
Oh,
Thank you.
I'll let Dr. Reed, the clinician, answer that question. The researcher wants to build on the point that Dr. Liverpool made. I think it was an important point of that within the church context, we can create a supportive environment for our youth that give them reason to be optimistic and to look to the future with hope. And I want to share with you a striking study of suicide that was done among young people. At the time of the study, the indigenous population of Canada, young people, teenagers in Canada, had the highest rate of youth suicide in the world. And two clinicians, researchers, went into 196 First Nation indigenous communities in Canada. And to their surprise, as a group, this group had the highest rate of youth suicide, but half of the communities they visited did not have even one suicide in the last 5 years. So they were struck by that. Here is a group with high suicide, and half of the people have none at all. And they started to ask, what's different about those societies where they are finding, those communities where they're finding suicide versus those that they weren't? And they found that there were not suicides in communities that were fighting with the government of Canada over the titles to land, over the right of self-governance, over the ability to run their fire service and their schools and their police services, and had a place in the community where they taught their children their history, their culture. And so it was these markers of what the researchers called empowerment and engagement and cultural affirmation. All of these were protective. They found a dose-response relationship. So the more of those a community had, the lower the likelihood of suicide. So there is an enormous opportunity here for the church. In addition to the excellent points Dr. Liverpool made, the church can also be a place where young people are trained and we create opportunities where they can work and make a difference in the community, helping others and doing good and making a difference for others can be a powerful a sense of providing a sense of meaning to life and that they are making a contribution by what they are doing.
I love
Mr.
I thank you
Moderator,
so much.
Mr. Moderator, I want to go back to the question. The question about what parents can ask their children. Rather than focus on the parents asking the children questions, I think it is better for the parents to look for signs of suicide ideation, persistent sadness, or a sense of helplessness, loss of interest in the things they used to do, sleep changes, losing weight. Just they should look to see what they're seeing in the children, and from those questions, from the observations rather, then they can proceed to make such an inquiry. But I think it's better to look and see what changes they're seeing in their children before they start thinking, should I be asking if you have suicidal ideation?
Thank you so much for that. I think it's important for us to recognize that at all levels of the church's structure, that we can actually foster and have this culture of being able to first engage with the topic, because there's hesitance, there's stigma to engage with a topic such as mental health, even in this day, especially within the Caribbean. We sometimes say that mental health is, and in Spanish, I'm thinking in Spanish, sorry, but they say, no es un asunto de locos, es un asunto de todos. It's not a problem for crazy people, it's a problem for everyone. So we have to recognize that mental health challenges affect each and every person, which is why I like the fact that Dr. Williams was almost advocating for a psychological first aid brigade within the church. It sounds like a far-fetched idea, but it's something that we can do simply by utilizing the youth structure of the church and the youth arm of the church, training some of them with psychological first aid to be able to see signs, as we're saying, in their peers, and even allowing them to be able to start teaching and sharing at home with their parents what are some of the signs and what are some of the challenges that their peers may be facing. Dr. Reed, I know that we had asked you to just touch on this. If you could kindly go ahead, please.
Okay, so I'm going to take advantage of the open mic because I want to touch on what Dr. Liverpool said as well, and Dr. Williams. So hope, optimism, psychological first aid, and all of that, I agree 150%. Those things are important, and those are things that the church can offer persons who suffer from mental illness and suicidal ideation and behavior and so. But before we even reach there, there is a crucial step. I just want to ask in general, how do we, as a body of believers, respond to people who are suicidal? Let's be honest with ourselves, because we heard in some of the reports from individuals, things like, we can't bury him because he committed suicide, and all kinds of other comments. I think we need to start with, how do we respond to suicidal behavior and expressions among our members? I would like to put it to everyone, based again on my experience as a clinician, that in the church, suicide and suicidal thoughts are regarded by the majority of individuals as a moral sin. Someone dies from suicide, and what do we hear? They are going to hell. They could never make it to heaven. Someone expresses suicidal ideation. Oh, if you had more faith, you would not think like that. If you prayed more, you would not feel like that. So before we could even reach the hope or optimism or psychological first aid, we have to look at the stigma associated with suicidal thoughts and behavior in the church. We have to address that first and foremost. And there are a lot of things that we have to destigmatize. We have to destigmatize mental illness. We have to destigmatize mental health treatment. We have to destigmatize suicide and suicidal behaviors. And once we get that done, then I think that the other things will flow, after that. And that's a big hurdle. So that's one comment. The other comment has to do with whether we should ask people about suicidal ideation. So again, Dr. Liverpool, I agree with him fully. Parents, teachers, church members should be keen in looking for the symptoms of depression, and he would have highlighted many of them, because sometimes we see these things and we ignore them because of discomfort, because of stigma. We chastise, you should not feel like that. So we want to look for all of the signs of depression, and we need to relate to that compassionately. But I think it's also very important to ask about suicidal ideation, and to ask early. Because as a symptom of depression, by the time an individual has those symptoms of insomnia and poor appetite and sadness and crying and so on, they could have suicidal ideation as a symptom, which they do not express because of the stigma. So we need to be able to engage in conversation non-judgmentally, compassionately, with confidence, to be able to talk about the topic and ask people, are you thinking of killing yourself? It's a myth that if you ask, you encourage them to do it or push them to do it. That's just a myth. And asking that question might just save a life, because now you can have that person talk and vent and share, and then you inject the hope and the optimism, right? So asking is important. But I want to just add a little to that, in that when you ask, or if you ask, be prepared that if the person says yes, you do not switch into that judgmental mode, because then you do more harm than good. Okay, so I'll pause here.
Ryan here, if I could just jump in. Dr. Reed, I'm so happy you mentioned that, because that was one thing I was gonna talk about. Just based on research as well, asking is important. And then it caused me to think, like, what is holding us back from asking sometimes? Is it that is there a prejudgment thing? Or we're fearful that we're gonna be judgmental after hearing yes, having these thoughts or these ideas? Is that a factor that may be preventing some of us from wanting to ask? So I'm so excited you said this. And two, what I was also alarmed about in terms of just reading and preparing for this, it's just I'm concerned about men in general. Just it's so many men that die by suicide, and the rate of men dying is higher in all countries. I was looking through some of the data that's provided, and in every country, sometimes men were 2 or 3 times higher in terms of rate of suicide. So I know there is a role for the church to play, and I know men are supposed to be, the leaders. We're supposed to be this macho mentality too, as well. I know prevents a lot of men sometimes from talking, and I understand it. A lot of men aren't always expressive, so we bottle up a lot of things. So I think there's a role for the church to play. It's just youth. It's not just youth, but I'm concerned about men as well.
I want to just pop in for a quick second, as you mentioned, and particularly within the church setting. The culture that we need to address related to mental health and even suicide, actually, I think it stems from our understanding of our theology regarding death. If we understand what we believe about death, then we'll be able to understand a lot better um, what is the concept behind why we are so hesitant to speak about, especially suicide. I think that we have the vestiges of an old Christianity, is the word that I want to use, and you know what I'm speaking about. An old Christianity that still is pervasive throughout the Christianity that exists post the Protestant Reformation, that thinks of death as with a sort of finality that the Bible doesn't really espouse. The Bible really explains to us that there's hope for us, but the hope stems through Jesus Christ. We have to understand that if we believe that there's hope through Jesus Christ, we are not the ones that are to judge a person's life based on their experience or the way that their life came to an end. And that's a challenging thought for us. It's a challenging thought for us as Adventists, as Christians, as just human beings, to think of the fact that it's possible to allow God the final say, and we have to love people. And sometimes I think that becomes even more challenging when we have church cultures that tend to provide a perspective that is a lot more rigid, as we've said before, and there are higher expectations of perfection. And sometimes that type of religious cultural background actually triggers a person to have suicidal ideation and even perhaps complete suicide. We have to start thinking about this thing from a different perspective. And as we've been speaking about this entire topic for the evening so far, I think it's important for us to start thinking about not only challenging what we know in terms of what our current culture surrounding mental health is, but starting to focus on what we would like to see for our children and the future and even to how we can start changing the present. So my question now is, what are some of the ways in which churches can actually provide support for people who are struggling, one, with mental health, two, with suicidal ideation, and three, with those who are surviving the aftermath of someone who has completed suicide? Is there any one of our
Yes.
panelists just okay? Go ahead. And thank
I was waiting for you to finish to share. One of the things I think we sometimes miss when we're speaking about the issue of suicide is how it impacts the surviving family members. Many times when we think about suicide, we focus on the victim. And I'm currently doing a study on the impact of suicide on surviving family members. And so far, the information being received, it just leaves you in silence. And there are some family members who would have explained wanting to repeat the act to connect with the deceased. While it may sound bizarre to some persons, everybody has their own beliefs, but there's also the copycat behavior that we know is prevalent. And I know for sure of a particular private school here in Guyana that would have had more than I thought 2 suicides. But having a conversation with some of my students who are at university, they remark, oh, suicide, regular thing for that school. This person who shared that was also a student there and shared gruesome experiences of finding persons who would have done this. And it is not something that is highly publicized because of the school's image that is being protected. Adding to that, there's also another private school where the children are following each other because of loyalty in self-harming. And then they want to take it another level. One parent was keen enough to recognize behaviors that were not necessarily the norm and was able to nip it from very early. Unfortunately and fortunately, I had to expose my children to the conversation of suicide from my son was about 5, when in the presence of my children, 5 and 8, a teenager attempted to do it. And I had to take that bold step and educate them. And so far, they have been sharing with their friends what it is and all of that. Now, when we speak about suicide, many times we touch on the surface and we don't go very deep. The male folk within Guyana, there is also another study that I'm a part of that is suicide related. What they find out here in Guyana, many of the cases where the males commit suicide is not just suicide. It's murdercide. They commit the murder and then they take their own life. So that has a large chunk of contribution to the suicide rate attributed to males. But as I said, many times they bulk the suicide numbers and they do not segment it so that you can understand details of what all of these are. When we speak about suicide in terms of the church, there was a sad situation where a teen committed suicide within our church. And could I tell you what the church members did? Nothing. Silence. Those who spoke said if the family was more prayerful, the child was not going to commit, was not going to take his own life. Mark, you having interaction with the family recognized that the child was experiencing the aftermath of the parents' divorce. The child was having issues with his sexuality. The child was being bullied at school because of those 2 factors I mentioned earlier. And our church remained silent. What our church can do, our church can be more accepting of persons who are going through mental challenges and stop labeling them as not being spiritual enough. Many times, we don't have to necessarily read the Bible to someone to expose them to Christ. We can do more kindness. We can be a little bit more loving. We can be a little bit more patient, a little bit more tolerant. And even if we want to pray with them, it doesn't have to be in the moment where our prayer is so focused on them doing wrong and highlighting their limitations. we can pray in our private chambers for them and show more acts of love, kindness, patience, like I would have said, just as a starter, so that we can actually do something and stop say that we're doing when we're not.
Thank you so much. So I
I
did put
wanted
a,
to add a little bit
go ahead.
about what a church can do. I think there've been excellent things said already, but the church needs to work about creating safe spaces where these topics are not so stigmatized that someone who needs help would not feel comfortable because we judge them and we judge their spirituality. And that's important for adults as well as for children. Another thing the church needs to do is to destigmatize seeking help because you have emotional challenges. So that for some people feel that if they seek help, if they seek mental some sort of emotional support, it's a failure because if they only trusted God more, they wouldn't need this. Jesus is the great physician, and has created these technologies to help us and to help us manage our physical health and our mental health. That's another thing the church needs to do. A third thing the church needs to do is do some parenting. There's a randomized controlled trial, highest quality of scientific evidence, of a study of young African American kids. And they did an intervention with a group that got an intervention, and it had two components to the intervention. One was with the parents to improve the parenting skills and how they relate to their kids and how they involve their kids in conversation. And the other was for the kids, giving them a sense of affirmation of who they were and a sense of self-direction. But the parenting piece is something that a church can do, can equip parents to be more effective in terms of understanding emotionally where their kids are coming from and what they need to do. And finally, I mentioned this in passing earlier, research is showing that one of the biggest drivers of worsening mental health and more emotional problems in children globally is social media. Now, this generation of youth have not lived at a time without social media, so we're not saying there can be no exposure to social media, but there needs to be limits. Some studies find with 30 minutes on social media, children begin to feel worse about themselves because they see everybody else doing all kinds of wonderful things and they feel they are a loser, their life is nothing, their life is boring, and so on. So helping bring a sense of balance to the use of social media is also important. So that there are lots of ways in which a church can play a role.
Yeah.
Thank you. Go ahead. Thank you. Please go ahead, Dr. Lee.
Yes. So to add, because we're getting a nice long list there, to add to it, I just want to reemphasize it. It's been said, but the necessity to speak openly about it. I think that's important. We speak openly without judging and without degrading, but we need to use the Bible as well. I think that's important. Our congregation responds to the Bible. And people need to understand that even in the Bible, there are stalwarts of faith who expressed suicidal ideation. Elijah was so traumatized by his experience that he admitted to suicidal ideation, and God himself tended to Elijah. Job reached the point of might as well die. He had suicidal ideation as well. So we can use the Bible to show that, hey, this is something that happens, but we can respond to it with hope and faith, compassion and support. Now we have to use the Bible in another way. I would like to, I'm not a theologian, but I would like to challenge any theologian to show me in the Bible moral judgment of suicidal behavior. So I actually did a sermon on suicide and hopelessness and darkness and so. And in researching for that sermon, I looked to see the number of incidents of self-harming behavior in the Bible, and there are about 7 of them. And of those 7, about half of them had to do with the culture. Saul and his armor bearer when they felt that the enemy would, ridicule them and kill them in a harsh manner. And so they committed suicide. But there are also examples of persons who committed suicide when under stress, when emotionally distressed. But nowhere in the Bible do you find a moral condemnation of these people. So we need to start using the Bible to convince our congregation, because they're not easily convinced about mental health issues, that having suicidal ideation is not a sin, and we want to deal with it with compassion, but also emphasizing that I don't want to use the word committing, it flows off my tongue because I'm an older person, but taking your life by suicide is not morally right. And there are things that need to be done. And these are all the things that we've been discussing in the last 15, 20 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you so much. As we've been having this discussion, I think we've been able to touch on so many different factors that relate to not only our church, but the community, not only mental health, but suicide ideation, suicide, trauma. We touched on such a wide and vast range of topics. I also want to recognize that Dr. Liverpool, who was with us a little while ago, he had to pop off of the platform because he had another pressing engagement. Want to thank him for his contributions this evening. And the fact is, before he left some comforting words for us in the chat. So the words that he left for us are that freedom from discrimination and violence are some of the things that would help us address the issues that we face in church. Social inclusion and access to economic resources are important in addressing the topic of suicide. I think that's very important, as Dr. Williams shared with us, the discrimination patterns that happen in the US, and then we were able to look at what happens in the Caribbean region and recognize that maybe inequality in terms of finances or different factors may be affecting us here. I even heard the joke that Latoya Atatucker would have made in terms of another major issue that affects darker skinned peoples within the Caribbean, the issue of bleaching, and how the idea of body image can impact persons. We even get to touch on that, how the issue of body image and how it affects our young people, our teens, and even our adults, and how that can even lead to suicidal ideation, how the aspect of being bullied, as you would have brought up, Latoya, in Caribbean life and in the diaspora, there are certain topics that are very taboo. Mental health may be attributed with stigma, but there are others that are very taboo. So the idea of having sexuality or tendencies to having sexuality that is not heterosexual, that is also something that's extremely taboo within Christianity and within our Caribbean worldview or point of view. And even the concept of bullying and the readiness to use violence. It's interesting that Dr. Liverpool speaks about freedom from discrimination and violence. I think we have to really ask ourselves whether or not in the Caribbean we have become so accustomed to violence and violent acts, violent words, because of our history and part of our past. So much so that it becomes a part and parcel of the way that we speak. Just this week in a school, there was a child who told another child, if you touch my pencil, I will kill you. I'm saying that because my kids are in the background listening. So that's fair enough. But we see that we have such violent language that even is pervasive within our church settings. I'm sure the pastors among us might think of our church board settings and wonder whether or not we have some mental health issues that need to be assessed in some of those spaces. I don't know. I'm not saying that that's the case. I'm asking the question. I'm simply saying, without being facetious, that we have to start to interrogate this issue. We must speak about it. At the end of the day, if it remains unspoken, it remains hidden. And if it remains hidden, then we continue suffering and people continue to suffer in silence. And I think at the end of the night, what we want to achieve is we want to empower each and every person If you have a question, I'm going to ask you to type it into the chat. If you can possibly do that, I see a hand. I'm going to ask you to type your question in the chat so that I can be able to share it with the panelists, if that's okay with you. That's just the order. That's the procedure that we're using. So the person who has their hand up, could you kindly place your question into the chat, please? Thank you. Yes. So what we're doing is we have to recognize just how much this issue is pervasive and how much we need to start to address this issue. Now, I wanted to hear specifically from Rayvon and Latoya as you were getting closer to the wrap-up stage. I'm waiting for that question of the person who had their hand up in the chat. So I'm looking out for it. Don't think I've skipped you. But I wanted to ask Rayon, sorry, I apologize, Rayon and Latoya, wanted to ask you just to give us some final thoughts as we're getting ready. And we do have that question in the chat. The presenters can see it, so we'll address it as soon as one of them starts to just share their final thoughts. Rayon and Latoya. Yes. You have, yes, you're not getting, all right, good.
I was going to let Latoya go ahead, but so yeah, so I know there are a lot of questions in the chat, and to me, having a conversation, having a forum like this is one way of us helping with destigmatizing, talking about suicide, having this discussion in a space like this. I think it helps with this conversation, and it's more so now having more conversations like this that will help in the process. And I also wanted to add to some of the other things that was shared, just more so on a practical stage in terms of the church doing more and us as individuals, what we can do. Sometimes it's more practical stuff. The individuals that we're supporting, what are their needs? Some people have basic needs. Do they need food, money, clothing? What does that look like for the individual? So sometimes it's just doing basic stuff. Sometimes it's just picking up the phone and calling to check in on someone, like, how are you doing? There's so many of us who are around people and we're so lonely. So even though we're around all these people, there's no connection. We have nobody to talk to. We don't have the safe space to really share what's happening with us. So we can do simple stuff like this, just picking up the phone, calling someone, checking in on them just to see how they're doing. And you won't imagine the great difference that will have on someone that you're interacting with, because sometimes we don't know. There are a lot of individuals, and with social media, we see that we see great photos online, great videos online, or we're walking and we see people, they're smiling, they're talking, yet they're living with so much pain and hurt. They have unmet needs. So we just need to reach out more and just do basic stuff sometimes. It doesn't always have to be this huge, big task that we need to do. It's sometimes just basic stuff that we need to do. And just be as non-judgmental as you possibly can. Just be supportive, loving, live the fruit of the Spirit, or the fruits of the Spirit.
So true. I love that because it shows us, and it makes me think of Elijah's experience. The angel came, woke him up, gave him something to eat, and then he dealt with his other issues. So the first thing is we have to recognize that people, as you rightly said, have other issues, and we have to deal with the issues in an order of hierarchy. So you need to make sure that you take care of the basic needs first and foremost. Very correct. I see that there's several questions and comments that are coming in at this point in time. There's one which takes a little bit of a divergent view from the one that Dr. Reed have shared earlier about the theological background of suicide. And this is the exact reason why I was sharing earlier. We have to understand what we believe about death for us to be able to understand what we believe about suicide. It is a challenge that we have within the Christian world and honestly in some other faith backgrounds that there's a particular view of suicide that is one that is definitely condemnatory, and it is one that is said to be morally wrong. We heard from Dr. Reed before what she was saying. I am not going to advance a further position on this, but I'm saying that we have to be able to understand that we must leave judgment to God. That's my thought. We should leave judgment to God and not be the ones to judge ourselves. There's another comment about in this person, Grace Benjamin's community, many individuals who took their life did so after breakups from romantic relationships. Should there be an effort to teach persons to deal with such situations? I think this speaks to the entire idea of coping skills and coping mechanisms that we spoke about very early on in our conversation from Dr. Williams, Dr. Reed, and even Dr. Liverpool. It's very important for us to recognize that we need to learn how to develop positive coping mechanisms and strategies to be able to deal with the stresses and challenges of life. Yes, we need to also be able to understand that from a biblical perspective. So we need to be informed by our Christian worldview, and we need to also understand that we can also support one another because God gave us the ability to have community as a resilient boosting factor so that we can be able to bounce back from these various challenges. And finally, we have one more question, which is how important is knowledge of self in this issue of mental health? And one of the panelists just wants to touch that as a final question for this evening. I know I had asked Latoya to speak. So yes, thank you for being with it.
All right. So, in responding to the question directly, lest I forget, the importance of the knowledge of the self, many times we encounter problems because we don't necessarily understand whose we are. On that same point, I would like to firmly say, yes, we need to understand who we are, whose we are, what our purpose is when speaking about our mental health. There's some instances, of course, depending on the mental issue, even though you might have a sense of who you are and whose you are, you can still be predisposed to signs and symptoms. What is also important for us to understand, our Christian journey is one where the enemy, while he cannot read our mind, he can look at our actions and he can have plans. Why am I saying this? A lot of times when we're experiencing certain highs, we can be predisposed to stronger trials. And even if we look in the Bible and our history tells us, many times the persons who make some of the silliest decisions are some of the persons who made the wisest decisions. So it's two opposite extremes, and this is why it's important for us to constantly ensure that we are in touch and in check with God, and importantly, have a support system. While we know connecting with God is the key, having a support system here on earth is also necessary, essential, and important. And I think Dr. Williams alluded to it when he spoke about us having that community connection. And we are social beings, and research would have shown persons who have support systems experience challenges of whatever forms differently than the persons who don't have support systems. So the more we can be each other's keeper, we can help to affirm each other. It is going to help us. And I would also like to reiterate what Dr. Reed said, and I think we've all been echoing it. There's no good health without good mental health.
Thank you so much. And just before we close, I just want to say that knowledge of self is critical because having an awareness of your own genetic past is also a predetermining factor for your mental and emotional health in many ways. if you have a parent or grandparent or another family member who has suffered from sort of a mental health illness, there's a distinct possibility that you also may be predisposed to suffer in that same way. But the good thing is, once you are also able to access help and able to get support, life may not be easy, but the future will always be bright. God is great because he allows us to maneuver through life and to move forward, which is why I say once again, it's critical for us to do the introspection. And as Denise is saying it beautifully and succinctly, know God and know self. Thank you so much to each and every one of our panelists this evening. My name is David Springer. It's been a pleasure to be your moderator this evening. Once again, I'm about to turn over to Pastor Mariah as we're about to have the closing exercises. Thank you so much.